Have you heard of this novel by Robert Louis Stevenson called Treasure Island? It's a pretty old novel from the late 1800s, yet it's still one that is remembered even to this day, or at least its influences. There was even a Disney movie called Treasure Planet that is a sci-fi adaptation of this novel, and popular pirate franchises like One Piece and Pirates of the Caribbean have references to this novel. This novel also happens to be the reason for the various iconic pirate tropes that people still reference. Things like treasure maps, the phrase X marks the spot, talking parrots, peg-leg sailors, the skull and crossbones on the Jolly Roger being the iconic symbol of a pirate flag, and the infamous pirate shanty, 15 men on the dead man's chest, yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum. That's, yeah, very popular one. That's pretty much the influence of most of these songs. And as you can tell, the part about dead man's chest, Pirates of the Caribbean too, you can see its influences. And anytime anyone references pirates, odds are that your mind ends up thinking about one of these tropes. And what's even more impressive is the fact that this novel was inspired by a fictional map that the author drew as a way to entertain his stepson. Somehow he just drew this random map for fun and then made the story. And while there are various points that I could mention about the novel, I think that the way the novel shows how the journey affects Jim Hawkins is truly impressive. At the start of the novel, he was just a kid who was excited to go out to sea and excited by the thought of finding Captain Flint's treasure. And then near the end of the novel, however, he ends up vowing never to go to sea again and has nightmares about the adventure. This is somewhat different from other adventure stories about a youth who comes back from an adventure. They usually end up implying that the kid still continues to want to have adventures, even though they may have faced things that would have been considered to be pretty traumatic. Instead, Jin ends up being haunted by what he has experienced, and it's implied that he seems to be satisfied staying at the inn his mother owns and working there instead of looking for treasure, even though he even hears that not all of Flint's gold might have not been found, and that there still might be some left. And while he did technically have a happy ending, since he did find the treasure and used it to fix up his mother's inn, it still came at a great cost. It helped him realize that even though that the adventure and the search for treasure was something that he dreamed of, especially sailing out in sea, it ended up not being what he had hoped. Even though the idea of finding treasure is something that many people will love to happen, maybe even going on an adventure, it still ended up being something that ended up horrifying him. Even the pirates who attempted to find the treasure ended up being consumed by their greed, causing to end up losing their lives for that treasure, or to be stranded on the island where the treasure was once hidden. And while Jim Hawkins' desire to find the treasure didn't result in that same downfall as the pirates, it still caused him to lose his love of the sea, and even not even caring about the fact that there might be more treasure about that he could still find. And the response that Daniel had to King Belshazzar is one that most people wouldn't have the guts to say, especially to his face. I mean, odds are that it wouldn't have been the type of reaction that most people would have, at least not one they would probably say out loud. Maybe it would have been something they might post on social media or vent about to a friend, but odds are it wouldn't be something that they would say to the person in question. While it may seem like Daniel is being humble when he refuses King Belshazzar's offer, which does make sense, Daniel is actually insulting the offer, implying that anything King Balthazar gives him is worthless, which is different from how he interacted with Nebuchadnezzar, since he was actually usually more polite and humbler to him. And this may not be something that you would assume, especially when you consider what Belshazzar was about to give him. Not only would Daniel be given a chain of gold and purple clothing, which was an expensive color during those days due to how difficult it was to find the ingredient for that type of color, but he was also going to be the third ruler of the kingdom. Well, Daniel's position in the kingdom wasn't a bad one. I mean, it was a pretty good position, especially for like a foreigner. This promotion that Belshazzar promised to Daniel would have been something that nobody would normally refuse. It was something that nobody would even have dreamed of even being possible. This was the type of opportunity that people would do anything for, yet Daniel treated it as he was offered something completely useless, or something that is like something as random as like a piece of pocket lint. Before getting into the reason for why Daniel responded the way he did, we first need some background information on this passage. This passage starts by mentioning that King Belshazzar made a great feast. While translation says that King Nebuchadnezzar is Belshazzar's father, the word for father that is used in the passage can also mean predecessor or ancestor, meaning that Belshazzar was most likely his great-grandson. This helps us see that some time has passed after the events of Daniel 4 to what happens within Daniel 5. And according to historical texts, odds are that the feast was happening around a time where the kingdom was under siege by the Medo-Persian army. Not only that, but his father, King Nabonidus, has been captured by the army when he came out to fight them, which is why historians also say that King Nabonidus is the last king of Babylon instead of Belshazzar, since he was only a co-regent, though the people under him would address him as a king, similar to how in Koreans, we technically have like, there's also 목사님 is pastor, but also 전도사님 and gondosa님. Some people still also use that as a way for pastor, even though it's technically not the right term. I mean, it's like a similar higher up position, but not actually the position kind of phrasing, which would have been the co-regent for Belshazzar. So while technically he's not king, he still would have been considered king. And this makes the timing of Belshazzar's feast a bit odd, since you would think that having his own father captured by the enemy may cause him to worry. Maybe it was a political move to prevent the lords that helped govern the city feel like they don't have anything to worry about, since Belshazzar is there to govern the kingdom. And of course, there's a possibility that maybe he was an incompetent ruler that likes to hold feasts and was clueless about what's going on in the kingdom. Kind of like the ones you see in like these historical dramas, the incompetent ruler or the scarecrow ruler, the weak figurehead, puppet that has no idea what's going on and likes to spend their days partying or eating a large amount of food. Though according to history, it's most likely the first one. He was just it was basically a political move by his. And while most historians do agree with that, there is actually another reason. It's also due to the fact that Belshazzar was being arrogant and not taking the threat seriously. Even though there was a siege happening around the kingdom, Belshazzar believed that the walls of the kingdom were enough to protect them. According to historians, the walls were estimated to be about 17 miles long, 22 feet thick, 90 feet high, had guard towers that were 100 feet tall, and a bronze gate along with a moat. I mean, you could see why he would act this way. I mean, this would have been a very difficult thing for the army to conquer, which is probably why Belshazzar didn't think that he had any reason to worry about the kingdom being invaded. Yet, at the same time, a feast would still have been a bad idea, since it would have been better to conserve their food and water in order to outlast the enemy, since these things can even last for months, even decades, depending on the enemy's resources and whether or not the people within the kingdom are wiped out by a plague, which does happen. Belshazzar foolishly believed that their army would give up after a couple of days, which is why he decided to throw a feast so that he could mock the army and to assert the superiority of his gods over the enemy's gods. And this is further emphasized when Belshazzar commands that the gold and silver vessels that were taken out of Jerusalem be used as drinking implements. It wasn't bad enough that he was displaying them as decorations for the feast. He was using them so that he and his guests could drink wine out of them. And if that wasn't bad enough, he and those involved started to praise the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone while performing the sacrilege. Basically, Belshazzar was committing various types of sacrilege of God during the festival as a result of his arrogance. It would have been the equivalent of drawing maybe graffiti on the Statue of Liberty, or if someone attempted to melt down the Liberty Bell to make a bronze statue of themselves for some reason. Why? Not sure, but people do have strange ideas. It may not seem like much, but a lot of people would be mad if someone would even consider doing such a thing and would probably mock them and insult them for doing such a thing. And this leads to the part of the story that people may most likely be familiar with, the fingers of a human hand suddenly appearing and writing on the wall. According to the text, the king was so afraid that the color of his skin changed, his thoughts alarmed him, and he lost control of his limbs, causing his knees to shake. It became even worse when he realized the enchanters, Chaldeans, and sorcerers, basically the wisest men of all of Babylon, were not only unable to interpret the writing, but they were unable to read it as well. You would think it would make sense for him to feel shocked by what had happened, but for him to have this type of reaction does seem a bit strange. I mean, due to all the drinking he had probably done at the feast, you would think that he might have assumed that he was seeing this as a result of having too much wine. Yet, the way he reacts is peculiar. It hints at the fact that he understood that what he was seeing wasn't a result of having too much wine, but something that was a result of a divine judgment that is about to happen. There's a part of him that understands that he messed up, but at the same time, he's not sure how he messed up, only that something was going to happen. This helps us see that the judgment that God passes on Belshazzar is different from when Nebuchadnezzar was judged by God, as shown when Daniel references the events of Daniel 4 in verses 18 to 21. While both of them did act arrogantly due to their pride and were punished for it, Nebuchadnezzar still understood that God is a divine being that deserves respect. Even though he was okay with raiding the temple for the vessels of gold and silver, he still wasn't foolish enough to commit this type of sacrilege by using them as drinking implements or even taking them out of his own temples. And while he was willing to take them and put them in the temples of his own gods as a sign of dominance, Nebuchadnezzar still respected the fact that they were sacred objects that were placed in the Israelites' temple of worship, and his interactions with Daniel and his companions helped him to grow to respect God in his own way. Now, he may not have like a completely good idea, but he still knew that God was still a divine being and that he still deserved respect, unlike what Belshazzar was doing. And because of this, Belshazzar's actions actually makes him seem like they were nothing more than common household items, and that the significance behind these items were worthless compared to his own might and will, and that there's no reason for him to think that God is deserving of respect or worship. This punishment helps us see that the punishment was a result of the state of his heart, and not simply because he was ignorant in what he was doing. Daniel points out that even though Belshazzar knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar and why it happened, he still didn't humble his heart and instead believed himself to be greater than God. His position of power and greed made him think that there was no reason for him to fear judgment and that those who oppose him would fall under his might. Yet, ironically, according to history, this so-called siege of Babylon during this time wasn't a typical siege, since it didn't actually last very long, maybe like a couple of days at most, and the only one who was actually killed was Belshazzar. That type of result is pretty reasonable, especially for a siege. I mean, it's kind of ironic that Belshazzar was so confident in the defense of the kingdom and the power of his gods that he ended up being the only one who was slain when the Mede-Persian army conquered Babylon the same night this feast had happened. And the fact that Daniel responded the way he did not only proved that Belshazzar's promise was worthless, especially since there's no way the invading army would have upheld a promise of a dead ruler, but that Belshazzar's sacrilege is why the kingdom of Babylon fell, as it was foretold in the vision of the statues made of different metals in Daniel 2. The kingdom was blessed by God since God was using it as a way to punish the Israelites for their disobedience, only for the kingdom to basically pretty much fall because of a similar disobedience. Or I guess it's technically worse because they committed a greater act of sacrilege. And even though it was originally the greatest kingdom in the world, it still ended up falling due to the fact that the one who was ruling dishonored God in his heart. He allowed the success that his predecessors had go to his head, which ended with the kingdom's downfall. And This feeling of arrogance and this greed is something that we need to be wary of, especially in the modern world. The world we live in is one that often encourages ourselves to think highly of ourselves, making it seem like there's no greater power than the ones that we allow or what the system allows. This is especially true of people who are in positions of power, whether it's in a government setting or even in some cases a school setting where you're like the head of a sports team or like maybe the class presidents or something. It's easy for a person to become arrogant, thinking that their own abilities are the reason for why they are chosen and that there is no one better than them. It doesn't help that technology makes it easier for a person to act arrogant since they can make themselves seem like they are better than others when in reality they aren't really that impressive or they're pretty much the same as everyone else. This isn't something that only affects non-believers, but also Christians if they are not careful. One of the problems that Christians have is that they often forget to humble their hearts before God and allow themselves to be swept up by this type of thinking. There are times when a Christian may act like they are better than non-believers or that they are the best type of Christian and that other Christians should be like them, like they're the best example. They forget that it is only because of Jesus saving us, making us a new creation before God, that we are even able to call ourselves Christian. It was never a result of our own efforts or skills, but something that God had to give us since it was impossible for us to accomplish by ourselves. It makes no sense for us to think that it was all because of our own doing, because it wasn't, nor will it ever be possible for that to be true. And that's why we always have to look at Jesus as the example of being a Christian, since it's literally impossible without him. And similar to how Jim Hawkins realizes the dangers of the sea that he never considered, let us make sure that we do not allow ourselves to become arrogant. Let us remember always to humble our hearts so that we will be able to properly honor and glorify God throughout our life. Let us make sure that we honor and thank God for all that he has done, and to make sure that we spread the example of humility that Jesus has given us. As it says in Philippians 2:3-4, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. Let us pray.